Us to act as sort of discussants, and so we asked them to listen to the talk and think about how that might relate to either what they're currently doing, if people feel they're taken on board, we'd be interested to hear that, or what they might do based on what they've heard, or, as I said to them, you don't even have to agree with a keynote speaker, you're within your rights to push back or disagree with that as well, or think about how that might be problematic here and so on. So what we'll do is we'll ask each of our colleagues in turn to have a little bit of a commentary here, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion there. You can either query them or you can ask questions more broadly or discuss them more broadly. So the idea of this is to, rather than a conventional question-answer session at the end of the keynote, to have a bit more of a deeper engagement and to be sort of more collaborative with what we're doing, which I think is broadly consistent with our speaker said. So I'll first invite Dr. Matthew Hayward, who's the Farley Associate Dean Learning and Teaching, to give his comment and feedback on the keynote and tell us what he thinks about it. Thank you.
Thank you, DVC. For the sake of those who are watching on the camera, I'll just observe that it's freezing cold in this room, and so if you see my hand shaking like this, it's not just nerves, it's also the temperature in the room. I suspect, although DVC presents it in a different order, I suspect what the audience would like to hear is, from the panel, is some challenging, some provocative comments in response to the talk. And I'm afraid in that respect I'm going to disappoint, because I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Professor Bishop had to say. And it accords with my own experience here, teaching at USP. The teachers, the lecturers who we know are the best teachers and get the best results and responses from our students are the ones who are teaching in exactly the way that Professor Bishop described. So I don't have any disagreement whatsoever. In lieu of a challenge or interesting argument, I would just reflect on a couple of things. One, upon one of the challenges that I see in applying that method of teaching across USP as a whole and across all of our programs. And secondly, just something that I think it's worth us thinking about at USP in relation to capacity building. So the challenge is a predictable one, I'm afraid, but the challenge that I can see is, how do we build that kind of the family connections, that relational teaching in an online mode? Now, it's not impossible, and before CFL start looking daggers at me, I realize that there are ways of approximating that the relational mode of face-to-face teaching in an online mode. But at the same time, there's an added obstacle or challenge to overcome, both for the lecturer teaching in online mode and also for the learner learning in online mode, especially if that's a new mode for them, if they're not well accustomed to using online systems at all, and especially for their education. So it's not at all meant to undermine the drive towards online teaching at USP. I think it's valuable, and I think it serves a valuable purpose as one of the modes in which our learners can best be taught. In particular, I think it's a challenge for us at USP to try and find ways of making sure that our students who are based at campus, and I mean all campuses there, not just Laucala Campus, the students who are based at a campus are able to experience the face-to-face relational teaching that Professor Bishop described so well. So that's the first challenge for us, how we can find ways of introducing that relational method to the online mode. My second comment is picking up on capacity building, which Professor Bishop talked about at the end as one of the key elements of the pedagogy and the mode of teaching that he discussed. And I guess my question, and it's a rhetorical question, and it's certainly not a challenge to Professor Bishop. I'm sure it's something he's reflected upon at length and probably written about. I won't know it until I pick up his book after this talk. Relational learning is a means to student success. But my next question would be, success in what? Success at what? So Pacific scholars have been arguing for half a century that colonial and neo-colonial curricula impose a foreign mode or way of thinking that's by definition at odds with indigenous Pacific ways of thinking and epistemologies. So, if it's at odds with Pacific ways of knowing and thinking, then colonial and neo-colonial curricula are an obstacle to relational learning because they prevent making use of the students' prior learning, if it's a way of thinking that's at odds with their ways of thinking and experiencing. So I guess my next question, or the comment that USP may think about, and we may think about as educators at USP, is how can we integrate that relational mode with high expectations, relational teaching, and constructive, encouraging feedback? How can we integrate that with a curriculum that's Pacific-led and Pacific-determined? It means seeking and developing Pacific scholars, first and foremost, and where that's not possible for whatever reason, it means appointing and engaging scholars who are willing to learn indigenous epistemologies and ways of thinking, even when, with a very busy schedule, that's against their immediate self-interest. So that's my only two comments. Thank you.
Excellent. So what I might do, I think you've made some very interesting comments there. So I think I'll open it now. If anyone from the audience wishes to comment on what Matthew said. Som, I'm not surprised you want to say something. We'll see what you have to say.
I'll make a quick comment. Matthew, thank you very much for the observations, and thank you, Professor Bishop, for those comments. As you rightly said, we agree with everything, and we could ask innumerable questions about, how to do this, how to do that. But the point I think, would be useful to think about it, reflect on a little bit, is to say that there is no one size that will fit everything, right? There is no one teaching or learning model that will fit every learner, every content in every subject area. What would be useful to think about, and this is my foray into that, is to think of teaching as a creative process. That every teacher, whether you're in a high school or primary school or secondary school or wherever, think of teaching as the design science. That teaching is about designing learning experiences for those kinds of situations. And what you might do in your language class could be very different what Ciro might do in his marine sciences class. But the fundamental principles are the same, What Professor Bishop was saying is backed up by years of theorizing about teaching and learning, So we know all of that, but the question is, how do you put it together? And there's no one straightforward answer to that question. Everyone is a contributor to that process. So if we think about teaching as a creative science of designing learning experiences for students, then what you might do is good for you. Let's not beg about and complain about this colonialism bullshit, because we need to know what the Westerners have. We need to know that knowledge as well. We can't just simply be sitting in the confines of our traditional culture and say, this is what we need to know. Because for our Pacific Islanders to be able to get out and compete with the rest of the world in the US and the UK and Europe, they need to know the science as well. So we're not going to throw the baby out the bathwater. Everything is important. So I think the thinking of teaching as a creative process, that the model that you might come out with is quite different from the model that Ciro might come out with, but we know the basic fundamentals of what works and what not works. So think of teaching as a design process, as a designing of learning experiences process. Then we're not asking these rhetorical questions, because then we know what is good for us, and what is good for our learners is good for us, and what might be good for somebody else is good for somebody else. But the fundamental principles are understood.
Okay, thanks for that. Anyone else like to make a quick comment before we move on to the next panelist? And Cheryl?
Thank you very much, Matthew. The concern that I have would be for the really remote students. So the students who are in other campuses, many times there would be an on-site person who would build this relationship with them, who would work with them to discuss ideas, issues, etc. But have you ever, most of us would have had emails from students who are living inland in some community, and they are the singular student who doesn't understand how to use a computer, barely understands the curriculum, because the language is foreign? And how are we reaching out to those students, connecting with those students in a way so that they could become part of that learning family?
Thanks, Cheryl. I think that the really interesting points there, and I think that's the exact type of conversation I was trying to get going during this panel session. So I'll just make one quick comment and then move on to our next panellist. Then I think, you know, what Matthew's highlighted is the environment and the context in which USP teaches is quite challenging. It is quite different, and then Cheryl's explicated a further aspect of that as well. So if you think about print mode students, how do you encourage, build that relationship by somebody who is sitting there reading print materials in a very traditional model? So I think that is a good thing for us to understand the context and try and think about how we can take that on board. As Matthew says, that's not going to be simple. I think that it's evident that it's not going to be a single solution to it either as well. So our next panellist is Dr. Sarah Amini she's a lecturer in the School of Social Sciences. So I'll ask her to make some comment. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Bishop, for your very inspiring talk. And like Matthew said, I don't think I disagree with anything in it. I really do believe that building the relationship is a necessary part of making discursive pedagogy work. I think from my experiences, I find that one of the things that we fall back on deficit, what did you call it? The deficit language approach often when we are trying to explain and rationalize what has happened in the classroom in staff room conversations. I would be curious to know, either from Professor Bishop or others in the room today, of how we call that out, but in a way that's productive in changing behavior. So I think Professor Bishop talked about how recording and then kind of putting that back out there to create that context of critical self-reflection. I'd be curious of how we can do that more, and different specific strategies we can do in our own schools or with our colleagues that help us kind of see that and do that more often. So that's something I would like to hear more about, because I find often I hear it, but I'm not sure exactly how to speak out about it. And then I think Matthew's already talked about the aspects of online how we create relationships in the online context. I think the other thing that I wanted to talk about is the very important component of what Professor Bishop has said for postgraduate supervision. There's been a lot of talk, for example, in our school about how do we increase our completion rates and so on, and we're planning to hold a postgraduate supervision workshop. But I think sometimes our conversations go more towards, okay, what are the policies and the contracts and these that we need to build, and I feel sometimes that's taking away from what might be really important is in the relationships we're building and who's involved in the supervision process. There's a couple of us working on graduate supervision research right now outside of the global north context, and some of the conversations that seems to have come up in these articles relate to, do we need to bring in other members of the community in the supervision process to kind of create that extended family-like context, that support network? So is it just the academic supervisor that's needed, or do we need more different types of support systems that include the mental and health well-being, or can that all come from the supervisory team? So that's just a thought and a question that has been coming up, especially as we're preparing for that workshop. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's open for any comments or questions on what Dr. Sarah said.
Well, there's a bit of quiet. I just Might bring up one point that I think, again, going back to what Matthew was saying, sorry, Sarah, because I think it might be related.
Matthew, obviously got under your skin there.
The media, I mean, Matthew did say something about how do you do that in the online environment. I think, not because I'm a fan of that or a supporter of that, but I think, what the situation in the classroom is not very different from the situation in the online environment. The technology is different, the environment, the mechanics are different, but the principles are the same. So relationship building in the online environment is not any different from building relationships in the face-to-face environment. And I'm sure Professor Bishop would want to reflect on that himself a bit later. So I think we have to build those relationships in both kinds, all kinds of situations, in the blended learning environment. It's equally important. It's the principle that we cherish. So the question then is, how do you do it? And I'll go back to my initial idea. It's a creative process,
There, DVC Armstrong.
I'm sort of interested in this partly from a research student perspective, which you raised, and how we address the issues around the culture of research supervision. Because, it always seems to me as an academic that one of the most enjoyable parts of being an academic is supervising research students. And when you see research students supervised badly and seemingly sometimes with a lack of care and concern, it's a deeply worrying thing. But I think there's more to it, going back to Russell's point, there's more to it than simply an individual bad supervisor. And it raises for me I think a bigger question about the whole discussion that we've been having, and that's the relationship between learning and culture and relationships within the classroom and within education, and the notion of organizational culture across an institution, and how that relates to, or whether it's a factor which is in a sense precedes the discussion about learning and teaching relationships and culture in the classroom, or whether it's something which goes alongside it, and indeed how those things work together. But it does seem to me that there's some combination between how we relate to our students in the context of teaching and learning, and how we relate more broadly as a community in the university in terms of the type of organizational culture and type of relationships. So I would be interested in some discussion thoughts from the panel and from us in relation to those questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any other comments? Or Matthew wants to respond.
Can I just respond very briefly, since it's 2-on-1? Let me just level the punches, and then I'm done for the rest of the morning. That's fine.
Supposed to be interactive.
Yeah.
We're not here to be didactic.
Just to emphasize, PVC, that I'm not opposed to online, and I mean, as a person who lives 10,000 miles away from the country of my birth, some of my literal family relationships are literally maintained online. So it's not that I don't think relationships are possible online, including in an educational space. However, the challenge for me is when you have students who are on campus and are able to take advantage of the kind of camaraderie and the building of a family-like relationship within the classroom. You can approximate it online, but not so readily as with a group of students who are sitting in a room. And so I'm not suggesting that we try and develop our relationships in the classroom at the exclusion of online learning. That's also an important function, especially for those students who can't get to a classroom on a campus. However, one of the unfortunate effects of lecture capture, and we've been hearing about this recently, is that students, even on campus, don't turn up to lectures because they think it's okay, I can just catch the lecture later. And that's true that they can get the information later, but I think the main takeaway from Professor Bishop's talk is it's not just the information, it's the way in which that information is created and